Welcome to part 3 of my camper series. This is the inside of my camper. This is about where I'm at so far. Got the kitchen right there, running water, 12-volt fridge. That's my cabinet with my AC in it. It's a heat pump, so it actually does heating as well. And then this is my battery cubby. Got a big EcoFlow battery in there. And I've got 900 watts of solar on the roof. And that's pretty much where I'm at with this camper build. I have a few things to do. As you can see, the walls are not done yet. So I need to, actually I've got the panel right here. I'm going to be putting, it's kind of this felt material with a sticky backer. And I plan on putting this stuff everywhere in here. And once that's done, I'm going to trim it out so it looks nice and finished. And that'll pretty much be the finished camper after that. So it's kind of exciting. Like I said, super close to being done. Oh, I'm also going to be building a little cabinet right here. And then all the wires will be covered by the end of this. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at in the project so far. This video has nothing to do with all this stuff I've done inside here. This video is actually about how I took my DIY panels that I built and showed you how I built them in the last video, and how I constructed just the raw shell of this camper. So that's what the majority of this video is all about. But also I'll be sharing with how I built that rounded front that you can see there. I'll go into all the details as to how I built this door, which took some time, and I definitely have some regrets about certain things that I did with how I built that door. So I'll share all that with you in this video. And what else? Oh, the paint job. So I'll take you through the complete shell building process all the way to where I painted the outside of the camper. I kind of went with a mountain scenery design. Kept it simple, but I think it looks pretty good. Really quickly, before I share with you how I built this whole thing, which is more of a documentary style, so it's just all the footage. I just squished it all together, and I'm going to talk over it and share my thoughts with this and that about the whole build. Sorry it's so long. Hopefully somebody's going to watch it. But also I wanted to go over my design checklist. So I came up with 6 important design features that I wanted with this camper. And it basically is what pushed these exact dimensions for this camper. And the first one is solar. I already talked about that, but I wanted pretty much every square inch of the roof to be covered in solar, as much solar as I could fit up there. And I have 2 450 watt panels, and this is the only thing that really gets in the way. So basically from here back is just dead space that I used for this vent, and then the rest of it is all solar all the way to the rounded front. And that's so that in the future I never think to myself, boy, I wish I had more solar, because I can't fit any more up there. So that's that, and it works really well actually. This battery is, oh boy, I am completely blanking actually as to the size of this battery, but it's a big one. I think it's 3600 watts. That sounds right. I'll put the correct number on the video here so you can actually see how the size of the battery, but it's been great. I have not ran out of battery, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I've got AC going. The thing that uses the most actually is this, which is my hot water heater. It's electric, so that actually uses the most electricity, but I don't use that all the time, but it still uses a lot of electricity. When we've taken this out camping so far, I use this appliance for morning and afternoon, and then I make sure that the battery is pretty close to fully charged by the time we get to the evening. So prioritizing the solar has been important. So number 2 on my list is to improve the aerodynamics, which is basically just making a nice rounded front. And I had a bunch of different ideas for that shape, but I basically came up with a really large circle, and so the middle of the circle is actually really far down there, and then it's just a part, just a small section of the circle. So that's what I did there. It's probably not going to increase the fuel economy of my truck by that much, but every little bit helps, and so that's why I prioritized rounded rather than just a squared off front, which a lot of campers do that, and that's fine, but I thought, why not make it round? And then the other big thing that I did is from the very top part of that rounded front, from right up there all the way to the back, it's about a 2-inch drop. And so having that drop down at an angle is going to also help with the fuel economy just a little bit. I'm probably only going to get 1 or 2 miles per gallon difference by doing it, by having the rounded front and the slope going down, but I thought, why not? It's pretty easy to do, and I will show you how I did that later in the video. Number 3 on the list was I wanted a queen size bed to sleep on, and this is just a mattress I bought from Amazon. It's a queen size trifold mattress, 6-inch, and so I basically built the width of the camper to fit this mattress, and then the length to fit this mattress as well. So that was a simple thing that just made sense to me. If I ever need to replace this mattress in the future, that's easy to do. Just buy another one. Another consideration was putting this bed north-south rather than east-west. But the issue with that is that it would just be super top heavy. I'd have to make the back end of the camper go a lot further out to counterbalance that. So that's why I went east-west, and it just worked a lot better to do it that way. But I would prefer a north-south. I just think that's nicer. But I've only got a 6-foot bed in my Tacoma, and so that actually brings me to the next thing on my list, number 4, which is to make sure that the camper can be shut inside the tailgate of the truck and locked, so that anytime I get to a trailhead or anywhere that I just need a little bit extra security, more than just having a locking door, I can lock it in the truck and it stays that much safer. So everything is kind of short. 6-foot space in here, which makes the bed space need to be short here. It just is what it is. Number 5 on my list is standing height. Probably goes without saying, but I want to make sure I'm not hitting my head on the ceiling, but I also don't want it too tall, because the taller it is, the more drag I'm going to have and the less fuel economy I'm going to be getting with my truck. So I had to figure out the balance there, and basically what I did was I sat up, well, I sat on the ground on top of this mattress and then leaned back and measured my head and figured out the height that I needed over the bed, which was 37 inches. And that's 37 inches from right here to the ceiling, not from the top of the bed. And then that gave me plenty of head space that I can sit up pretty comfortably on the bed. Not completely sit up, but, you know, mostly sit up. Here, maybe I'll just do it real quick. Just show you guys. So there, I'm sitting on the bed. So I'm hitting my head, but it's not bad. And then that gives me plenty of space back here, even though it's sloped from the front and coming back here, you can still see I've got plenty of headspace. And then number 6 on my list, which is the final number, was just building my custom door. This took a lot of consideration, but the main part of it that I needed to really truly figure out was the width to make this door, because I had to fit my 12-volt cooler through the door. And the 12-volt cooler is definitely the biggest appliance in here, so everything else is going to be fine. But the 12-volt cooler has to fit. Here what you're seeing, this little piece of trim that's fiberglassed in place, that's a 3/4 inch. I'll open the door real quick so you can kind of see it. So there's a flange there, and that sticks out 3/4 of an inch. The door frame itself is 1.5 inches, and then this is 3/4 of an inch. So I just had to basically figure out my opening to make sure all of that is going to work still with my cooler. So my raw opening ended up being 24 inches. That's what it was. And it worked because I got my cooler in here. So I had about 3/4 of an inch wiggle room to be able to fit my cooler. So at this point in the build, I've got my 6 main components, or parameters I should say, to my build. And I designed within those parameters, got the full design laid out in a program called Tinkercad. And then I figured out the surface area, or how many of the 4x8 panels I needed to build to be able to make this camper shell, which ended up being 15 is how many I needed, but I built a couple extra just in case I overlooked something or made some bad cuts. So I had 17 panels, and then I started chopping them up and assembling my camper. Pretty much all of the main cuts that I was making, I used my table saw and that fence you see that I'm ripping there, and then all my cross cutting, I use that big sliding saw attachment for my table saw. And then here I'm just doing a couple last minute measurements, making sure that the bathtub part of the camper is actually going to fit in my truck. And this is a part actually I wish I would have made it just a little bit taller so that I would have had just a little bit more space to reach those ratchet straps which anchor the camper to the truck. If you watched my previous videos, you'll know what I'm doing here. But basically, I'm just drawing lines that I'm going to score with my razor blade, and then lightly peel up the peel ply, and then it just rips up like a big sticker, and that gives me a nice textured surface that I can do all my joinery with. A top priority for me, especially at this stage of the build, was making sure that I could get all of these connections to a crisp 90 degrees, or as close to 90 degrees as I possibly could make it. So I cut out of 3/4 inch plywood these triangle pieces that I'm using as squares for these connection points. They're just temporary holds. I'm using double-sided sticky tape, and they just connect one piece to another, and then that ensures that I can get a 90-degree connection point when I reinforce this with fiberglass here in a minute. So now that I've got the braces in place, everything's squared up as good as I can make it, and it's pretty good. It's within a 1/16 inch from corner to corner, so that's well within the margins that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to be using this 5-minute quick epoxy that has a nozzle that mixes. I can really quickly tack down all the inside corners as I'm assembling this thing. I cut out notches on my supports that I made so that I have access to that. This 5-minute epoxy was such a good find for this project. I probably don't need to be using quite as much as you're seeing me use here. Just a few tacks here and there to just lock everything into place is really all I probably need to do. And here I'm mixing my fast setting epoxy that I'm going to add a silica thickener agent to make it nice and thick, and then I'm going to spread that on the inside corners to form my fillet. My one note here is that even though you can see it's kind of thick, it honestly just needs to be a little bit thicker even than what I used here. Because this is more on a horizontal surface, doesn't really matter too much, but later on when I have vertical surfaces, it truly needs to be as thick as I can make it so that it doesn't sag at all. Well, that worked out pretty well. This is my first time using this spatula I bought. Trying to make sure I clean up all my edges where it kind of spills out. I'm trying to collect it so it doesn't harden up and I have to sand that down. Right now I'm going to let this dry until it's kicked, and then I'm going to take off my braces and then lay down 6-inch, 6-ounce fiberglass cloth with resin, and that should really stabilize this part of the build. For future inside corners, instead of just using a cup, I did like the spatula. I thought that worked pretty good. It's really nice to be able to clean up the overflow edges nice and easily with this. But I think I'm going to use the bag method where I put the epoxy mass into a bag, into like a Ziploc bag, and then cut the end of the Ziploc bag and then just squeeze it into the inside corners. I just think it's going to make less of a mess. Yeah, I'm going to do it a little differently on the next set of inside corners. And actually, that was the last time I used that spatula. My favorite way that I use in a couple inside corners from now is just a big old popsicle stick. This is just a flush trim router bit. I've got it pretty much dialed in, but I'm a tiny bit over. That was purposeful, going a little bit over so that way I can flush trim it with this tool. For this project, I was using 3 different routers. I had this router designated for my flush trim router bit, and then I had a large round over bit. You'll see that tool in just a second. And then I had another router that I would use for smaller roundovers. I don't have a vacuum attachment for that router, so it's a little bit messy. For this one, I'm using my big old 1.5 inch roundover and get a nice round edge along all outside corners of the camper. The 1.5 inch roundover bit did add a nice look to the camper. It's a nice round edge, but honestly, just going with a 1 inch or even a 3/4 inch roundover bit would have been perfectly adequate for fiberglassing over, and I think it still would have looked really nice, and it wouldn't have been as dangerous. So the 1.5 inch bit is just overkill, and I would not do that again if I was to build another camper like this. This is my peel ply rack and fiberglass rack. You can see with the peel ply, I just have to cut strips out, and that's in preparation for every single outside and inside joint that I complete. And this is me mixing. This is my little mixing station. I won't be showing this throughout the whole video, but I thought just showing it a few times here at the beginning would be nice for you guys to get to see. So here I'm using just a 6-inch roller to paint on a primer layer of epoxy before sticking down my fiberglass cloth. And this is all fine and well, especially if this was an inside corner. A single layer of fiberglass cloth is perfectly adequate. But because the foam there is just a raw layer of foam, I don't have as much buildup of epoxy as I do on the rest of the camper. So for outside corners, what I wish I would have done is 2 layers of fiberglass cloth and really goop up all the epoxy there, so it's just a really thick, high build of epoxy that when I put my peel ply layer down over the top, underneath it I have a very protected fiberglass and epoxy corner that hopefully will resist dents and damage from things that might hit the corner. This part of the corner will be protected by the underside of the truck, so I'm not super worried about this corner, but other corners on the camper are potentially going to be damaged from things hitting it, and so the higher build you can make that corner, the better, really. And later in the build, I actually do go back through anywhere that I only had 1 layer of fiberglass cloth on the outside corner. I made sure to remove that peel ply and then add a 2nd layer, or in some cases a 3rd or 4th layer if I thought it would be getting hit quite a bit on that corner, potentially. Just a single layer of fiberglass cloth for the inside corner. Here I've got that fillet on the inside of the corner, and that's going to chemically bond to this epoxy that I'm putting over the top. And then of course I'm getting a mechanical bond. After I remove the peel ply, I'm left with that textured surface that the epoxy can get in that textured surface and create a nice mechanical bond. Also, it's pretty important to remember that you just have to remove the peel ply if you're going to try to get a good bond. If you leave any peel ply on, nothing's going to really stick to it. That's the whole point of the peel ply, is that you can leave a nice texture with it, but the epoxy itself is not going to actually stick to it. Here I had an idea to use my biscuit joiner for aligning these 2 pieces so that when I bond them together, they're perfectly aligned. And this is something I came back to periodically throughout the build. It was a good way to get alignment. If at any point I thought the alignment was going to be tricky, I got out my biscuit joiner, made alignment marks, and then put in those plastic biscuits, which was very important. Most of my biscuits that I've ever used in woodworking are made of wood, But since this is a synthetic build, I wanted to make sure I was using something synthetic that wouldn't potentially rot in the future if I ever had a little bit of water get in at any point in a joint for the camper. And something you've probably noticed at this point is that I'm not reinforcing the foam or the inside of the joint right there to the fiberglass where the biscuits are. I probably should be, if nothing more than just adding a gap filler, because you don't really want any air gaps in there at all. But you're not going to get a lot of strength from joining that section. All the strength is going to be coming from the outside of the joint, and the inside of the corner of the joint is where the strength is going to be coming from. But that is something I change later, but I do that for more as a gap filler than anything else. I decided I'm going to use just a little bit of super glue to tack my supports in place. Just a couple dollops should do with accelerator spray. I'm not going to melt the foam because the foam is protected, and it's really just going to be on the peel ply, actually. So when I remove the peel ply at the end of all this, all the super glue will be removed. And my thought process here is, even though that double-sided sticky tape that's holding in those triangle pieces is pretty strong, it's not that strong. And I'm going to be using my router on it here in just a minute, and I'm going to be reinforcing the outside corners with fiberglass, and I just need it to be as stiff and strong as possible. I can't have any movement in those triangle pieces for this to work out well. So you can see I just marked about 1.5 inches away from the ends, so that way when I use my roundover bit, I can go right up to that mark, and I can be just a little bit away from the ends, because that's where more foam is going, or more foam panels, I should be saying. If I went all the way to the ends, I would have to fill in that little bit of space that would be there. When putting on the peel ply, I started using a bubble buster for the first number of outside corners that I was doing, and inside corners, but really just a chip brush. It works so much better for this application, or just the roller with a little bit more epoxy on the outside. That works really well to push down the peel ply. So here I'm just getting a few last minute measurements to make sure that I'm going to be okay with these cuts. I have everything in Tinkercad already measured, already figured out, but when you've got the truck right there and you can make last minute measurements, it's a good idea to do that. Generally speaking, when using a table saw, you don't want more than a tooth sticking up over your material. But in this case, I wanted my blade all the way up as high as it could go so that I could get really far into the corner with this cut, so that all I had to do was remove about 1/2 inch of material with my handsaw to finish up these cuts. It's a really good idea to take your time with measuring out, laying out the cuts that you want to do for this, and even doing the cuts themselves, because you want a tight fit. You really don't want a lot of space. So just for the purposes of basically just filling voids, so if I have a 1/16 inch here or there that needs to be filled, instead of just having air in there, I'm going to use this stuff, which is a foam board specific adhesive. I'm really not using it for the adhesive properties, although it will help connect everything together, but I don't. So anyways, I'm going to use this on the inside where the butt joints meet. So once I put a pretty thick bead on here, I can put my puzzle piece in place. I don't want so much adhesive that I'm going to get a lot of squeeze out. I do get a little bit of squeeze out with this. I put just maybe a tiny bit too much, but I have to wait for that adhesive to dry before I can put any epoxy down. And you really want to clean it out pretty well, so the less squeeze out, the better, I would say, for this situation here. And then I'm just going to use some clamps with pieces of plywood to keep from damaging my foam, and let it dry, and then go through the busy work of applying 5-minute epoxy, a nice thick fillet, and then doing fiberglass cloth and peel ply over the top of it. At this point, I hadn't quite figured out how I really like to do my fillets yet. I have the bag method going on. That worked great on the last joint, so I kept doing that. I made my epoxy thick enough on this one. It's not going to droop on me, which is good. And here you can see I'm using a squeegee. The squeegee, I took a pair of scissors and made a nice rounded corner on one of the ends, so it's pretty similar radius to my popsicle stick method that I prefer using, but at this point I still had not tried my popsicle stick method, so I tried this instead, and it did work pretty good actually. Here I've got my scissors. I'm cutting, making sure that all my fiberglass cloth is going to lay down nicely. I highly recommend keeping some acetone nearby so you can clean off your tools pretty quickly. Otherwise you're just going to goop them up and potentially ruin your tools. And there's lots of last little minute snips I find that I was having to do because it didn't quite lay down right. And if it doesn't lay down right, you're going to get air bubbles behind the fiberglass. And if you get air bubbles behind the fiberglass, you're going to have problems potentially later on. And it's not going to be as strong. So really you just want lots of epoxy, error on the side of too much epoxy, and you don't want any bubbles at all when you have your finished joint done. If you do find bubbles later on when you remove the peel ply, you can fix them, but it's just an extra step. Definitely not my cleanest work, but you know, every single joint I do, inside or outside of the corner, I'm gaining experience points. The next one should be better. And honestly, this is how I'm looking at this whole project. This is practice for me eventually building a boat. And these skills that I'm learning now will hopefully transfer. So I want to cut these pieces right here, which will be about this high, and it'll tie in with that piece back there. But that piece is just a little bit proud. When I clamped everything together, it kind of squeezed it all in, so it was a little tighter than I was originally thinking it was going to be. Which isn't a big deal, except for I need it to be flush. So what I think I'm going to do is just put a board with double-sided sticky tape, stick it to it, and then just run my router along that board and get a nice trimmed up edge. So I think that's what I'm going to do. And this method really turned out well. I was really happy with it. The tape was plenty strong to hold that piece on, and this is a strategy I've used in the past for various cuts. But it was really important to remove this 1/8 inch hangover. Otherwise, I would have had a void when I put the next piece up against it, and that void would have needed to be filled with something, so I didn't have this big 1/8 inch air gap that's 1.5 inches tall. Throughout this entire build, I'm labeling the outside and inside that I want every single piece to be. The inside can be a little bit rougher, the outside I want a little smoother. If there's a bow, I want the bow to be on the outside so that you're not seeing a weird concave profile from the outside of the camper. Here I'm making 4 marks for my biscuit joiner, and then I transfer that mark all the way to the other side where I need to be cutting out my biscuit holes. Of course, I'm going to use my plastic biscuits again. But I would say at this point, the most important thing is making sure you cut the biscuits from the right side, because if you do the wrong side, it won't line up quite right, and then you'll be frustrated that you cut biscuits that don't actually align anything. I decided not to cut biscuits for that vertical section. You see where I'm putting tape right there. And I could have put biscuits, but it just didn't seem like it was necessary. And then once I have the piece in place, I can take that tape, wrap it around it, it'll hold it all in place. I do end up using a couple clamps to hold everything in place that much better. And then now I can go over to the other side and do the exact same thing. Still, I'm being really careful to make sure I don't put too much adhesive on the inside of this joint because I really don't want squeeze out. With the 5-minute epoxy, you always want to squeeze just about an inch out somewhere to make sure it's mixing properly, because if you do squeeze it into a corner and it doesn't fully harden, it's going to be very frustrating. So I always like to just squeeze about an inch out on something you can throw away before you start tacking things down with the 5-minute epoxy. And then everything else at this point is just routine 5-minute epoxy, fillet, fiberglass. Boy, what a mess. Yeah, my inside corners still need a little bit of practice. That corner's pretty messy. That one's getting quite a bit better. And on that one, I actually forgot to cut the peel ply as part of the prep. For the prep, I should really have everything scored, ready to rip off, have all the fiberglass tape cut, pre-cut, and ready to go, and then have the peel ply ready to go as well. And I forgot to do the peel ply this time, so I was kind of in a rush. I did use the fast hardener rather than the extra fast, and so it did give me just a little bit more working time. And that's good, because yesterday it was starting to kick as I was still working with it, and that's the first time this has happened actually on this project. So yeah, it's a good thing to go on the fast hardener, and it's pretty hot. It's probably 85 degrees in this tent right now. So okay, gonna let that dry. I figured I would have plenty of working time with my extra fast or fast hardener, but honestly, as the summer was ramping up and it was just getting hotter and hotter, my working times with the epoxy was getting less and less. So if I was to do this entire project again, I definitely would have switched over to a slow hardener when it comes to doing all the joinery that I'm doing here. Entropy Resin, which is the company that makes the resin that I'm using, or the epoxy that I'm using, says that at 77 degrees Fahrenheit, their extra fast hardener will last for 18 minutes for a pot life, their fast hardener will last for 21 minutes, and their slow hardener will last for 43 minutes. And I definitely wish I would have just stuck with the 43-minute hardener. You can get a little bit more working time out of any of these resins just by pouring it into a tray and spreading out the epoxy so that it has a way to get rid of that heat buildup, and that will keep it working for quite a bit longer actually if you do that. But on some of these days I was at 90 degrees, and so it was just way too hot for even the fast hardener. And as I was making bigger and bigger batches of epoxy for longer sections that I was taping and glassing, the slow hardener really just made a lot of sense. The bottom is actually narrower than the top. The top is kind of bowing out, which means that piece that I'm gonna splice in there over the head of the door is bowed out, and I'm gonna have to scrunch it in a little bit as soon as I get that header joint in place. Then I'll do the fillet and the tape and epoxy over the top of that. I started by cutting out my header the same width as the bottom of the door, and then made sure I had my alignment marks at the top there on either side. I could cut out my holes for my biscuit to make sure that the alignment's just right. And then I used a little bit of the foam adhesive to squeeze in between each of the joints. And then I could use tape as just a very light clamp to clamp everything together. I thought the tape was gonna be enough, but it didn't quite have enough hold, so I added a couple clamps, lightly clamped them together. I didn't put very much stress on the foam because I don't actually have any blocks to prevent the foam from compressing. And then I used my level as a straight edge to clamp together so that it would not bow out. Because it's not an inside corner, using the 5-minute epoxy is not going to work quite the same way. I probably could just go on the outside to temporarily tack it all together, but I'm going to reinforce it with just a tiny bit of fiberglass cloth. And I'm just going to cut a little strip. So I'm just going to use these 2 little strips to just tack it together. I should probably just add it to the fiberglass cloth first. Just those two little pieces, that should keep it tacked together, so when I pull all this off, I don't have to just depend on that blue caulking adhesive I'm using for strength. And maybe I should add a couple more, maybe on the back. You know what, why not? I've got the adhesive out, and it hasn't started hardening yet, so... Alright, that ought to do it. Better clean my tool before the 5-minute epoxy sets, because it's going to set quick. Once this little Band-Aid patch had fully cured, I realized I should have put peel ply over the wet epoxy as the final step. That way, when I continue doing my fiberglassing, all I have to do is remove that little patch of peel ply, and then I have a nice, perfectly textured, flattened surface ready for additional fiberglassing over the top. Because I didn't do that, I had to use some sandpaper and lightly scuff up that patch area because I couldn't count on a chemical bond between that 5-minute epoxy and the other resin that I'm using. Since they're different companies, there might not be a chemical bond available there. So that's why you have to rely on a mechanical bond. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, he's putting that 5-minute epoxy on the inside of every corner, and then I'm going over with a different resin product over the top of that 5-minute epoxy, I should technically be scuffing up that 5-minute epoxy so that I get a mechanical bond between that 5-minute epoxy and the fillet that I put over the top of that. But because that 5-minute epoxy is such a tiny, small little strip, and the amount of surface area that the fillet would be touching over that is just so minimal, I'm just not worried about it. If this was a boat and I'm really trying to maximize strength, I would be more cautious about that, but it's just such a small little strip of 5-minute epoxy. So if I did get delamination between that 5-minute epoxy and the other resin that I'm using for the fillet, it's just not that big of a deal. Here I'm using my biscuit joiner again. Unfortunately, I definitely made some holes there that I did not need to make, and so I actually had to fill those later with a little bit of thickened epoxy. But still, using the biscuit joiner worked out really well for putting on these large panels. And it was really important to make sure that the outside was lined up pretty close to perfect, because after I get done with my fiberglassing, I'm going to have to go over it with a fairing compound to make it as flat as I possibly can make it, so that you don't see a big joint seam going through the camper right there. So this is kind of a bummer, but I got to the point in the build where I need maximum headspace for the top of this camper, and I'm touching on that side against that bar, and I just tried to install it on this side, the other panel, and it's hitting that bar and won't let me get it in place. So I could just raise the whole tent however much I want to raise it up. That'd probably do it, and I probably don't need much, but a simpler way I think is just going to be to take it off the wheels. That would give me over 5 inches. So I think that's what I'm going to do, and try again. Got a little bit of glue on the surface, but I'll just scrape that off with a putty knife to get some fresh glue on there. Oh, actually, before I take it off the wheels, I'm just going to secure this corner and get that and this tacked together with the 5-minute epoxy, just so it doesn't move on me when I'm, I don't think it would do anything, but things might get rocking, and so I don't want it to move too much. The inside corner is easy to secure. I just use my 5-minute epoxy like normal in that corner. But then I do end up using a couple little Band-Aid patches of fiberglass and that same 5-minute epoxy, just like I did before. But this time I actually use peel ply over the top. I just cut out a little piece of peel ply that's larger than my Band-Aid and make sure I can completely cover all the wet epoxy, and that'll keep everything nice and flat. And then I just peel it off at the point that I'm ready for the larger section of fiberglassing over that seam. I think so that I can slide it around, I think I'm actually going to put a piece of plywood underneath it, and then I should be able to zip it around. In a little bit, I do end up putting a piece of 1/4-inch thick plywood underneath it so that I can slide it around and move it a little bit without damaging underneath the camper. But actually, when I finish the very top part of the camper, the sidewalls that are touching the top of my tent are actually not a problem, because I actually bring those down about 3 inches from the top, maybe 4 inches from the top, and then I can actually put it back on my dollies and I can cart them around on the wheels, and so I actually don't have to rely on the plywood as much in the future. It's honestly one of those things about this project that I wish my tent was just a little bigger. Wish it was a little taller, wish it was a little wider, but it's not, and I had to make do. All right, got the new router bit, and just to make it slide a little bit easier, got a little bit of wax paper. The wax paper will just make it slide a little bit easier on pretty much whatever surface. This is a really good trick to know how to do. I usually use this on wood, not foam, but I actually found it works just as well with foam. You just apply a little bit of the wax paper to your tool, to the sliding plate, and then you apply a little bit to the surface that you're going to be running the tool on. So in this case, it's the foam. And then that just helps reduce the friction so that the tool glides over the foam or wood or whatever thing you're cutting into. And actually, I even use this not just with my router, but I also use it with my table saw quite a bit, as the foam kept wanting to stick up against the fence of my table saw. And so I just use a little bit of wax paper that I'd keep nearby and just buff out the fence a little bit, put a little bit on the foam, and then be able to run the foam up against my fence without very much friction. Something to consider, though, when using wax paper or anything like this is that you might be compromising the adhesion you're getting to the foam in the future. So I definitely recommend keeping that in mind, maybe using a little bit of rubbing alcohol to buff out the foam to try to remove any wax or oils that get on the foam before you do additional bonding. And another thing to consider is that most solvents melt XPS foam. So if you're using a solvent to try to clean up foam, you definitely want to try this on just an extra scrap piece of XPS foam or whatever foam you're using before you try to use it on a piece that you're actually going to be using in your build. So up to this point, all my panels are nice and flat. You can check them by eyeball or with a straight edge, and everything came out really nicely when I was manufacturing them. But for whatever reason, when I built this panel off to the left and this panel off to the right that I'm about to glue in, they were slightly bowed, and they came from the same panel. They just came out a little bit bowed, and it didn't seem that bad at the time, but now that it's all finished and I've done my fairing compound on the outside and the inside, it definitely has the most amount of error of anywhere on the camper so far. And it's really too bad because this is such a visible spot from the outside of the camper. So to my eye, it's very obvious that there's something a little weird going on here, and it's just because the panels are slightly bowed. The solution to this problem is to just really taking your time with the fairing compound and making sure you get everything nice and smooth over every joint, and really just the whole outside. Everywhere that there's a little imperfection, it will show up very obviously as soon as you put paint over it, and even primer. Primer not quite as much because that's usually kind of a matte sheen, but the paint itself is probably going to be gloss or semi-gloss, and it's really going to show up every single little imperfection. So if any panels don't line up perfectly and there's a little bit of a bow to a panel, and you do even use fairing compound to try to minimize that difference in height of those panels, it's still going to show up. So for me at least, lesson learned to really take my time with the fairing compound part of the build and make sure everything is perfectly smooth before you add the primer and paint. Another problem with having a bowed panel that's right up against a panel that's straight is you get a really sharp ridge between the two. And anytime you want to lay glass, you want the surface to be either perfectly flat or have very nice rounded edges so that the glass just lays flat over it and you don't get bubbles that want to show up underneath the glass. So by filling in this crack with just a little bit of thickened epoxy, I can help smooth it out and keep bubbles from showing up under the glass, which would compromise the strength of this joint that I'm making. Here I'm chopping up a stick to act as my radius guide for the front of my camper. The front of my camper I want to be nice and round. I decided on making part of a circle with it. And so here I've got my marker sticking through the stick. The other side I have a screw. And then all I need to do now is take some scrap pieces, mark the top and bottom of my panels. And then now I can use my radius stick to draw underneath those marks. And then this will be the inside of the camper wall. And then obviously that will allow the wall panels to completely encapsulate this rounded front that I'm about to build. Before I make any cuts, I did need to do just a little bit of math. I'm taking the radius from my center point to the outer edge of the camper wall, not the inner edge, which is where I made my mark. And then now I can figure out the circumference, which is 2 times pi times r. I know my radius is 26 7/8 of an inch. Times pi times 2 equals about 168.86 inches. And then now I can divide that by 48 sides, or divide that by 3.5, because I knew I wanted it about 3.5 inches to 4 inches. So just dividing it equally into 48 sides gives me about 3.5 inches is the width of every single piece that I'm making. And that's the outside width, I should say. And that's approximately 20 pieces. I didn't know exactly how many pieces it was going to be right away, but I knew it was going to be close to 20. And then I divided 360 degrees by those 48 sides, which makes up the entire circle, and that gives me 7.5 degrees, which is the angle between every single one of those 48 pieces. And then I divide that by 2, which gives me 3.75 degrees, and that's what I'm going to be setting my table saw to. And then last but not least, I know that the inside width of my camper is 78 inches, so every single one of these pieces needs to be precisely 78 inches long. To set my table saw to 3.75 degrees, I need to take 90, subtract 3.75, and that'll get me 86.25, round up to make that 86.3, and that's what I'm setting my table saw to. Now, before I start cutting into an entire 4x8 sheet panel, which is what I need to build the front, I'm just cutting into little pieces of scrap and making sure I did my math right and everything is going to line up perfectly how I want it before I make an expensive mistake, potentially. First thing I do is cut out scrap pieces. I tape them all together against a straight edge. In this case, I just use my level. And then I check to see if this curve is going to match the radius that I drew on the inside of my camper wall. Once I can see that it does in fact work, I can count exactly how many pieces it's going to take to make the entire rounded front, which I counted 16 is how many I would need. And then now I can start cutting out the full-size pieces and assembling them to make the front of my camper. The first step, which I didn't show here, was to square up this panel and make sure that it's 78 inches wide, or actually just even a hair under 78 inches, because I don't want to have to trim off any extra once I cut all these pieces out and combine them, so that I just have a little tiny bit of wiggle room to get this thing in place. Something I feel like I should probably talk about really quickly is that the dust that I'm making from cutting into these fiberglass panels are pretty dangerous, and so it's a really good idea to have a decent vacuum system or dust collection system set up of some sort, and then just always wear a mask. And a KN95, N95, or respirator is a really good call to make sure you're not breathing in any of these dangerous dust particles. This is probably the most difficult stage in building this rounded front, and that's just trying to make sure that while I'm taping all of these pieces together, that every single piece is not going to be sticking out past any other piece, because any piece that's sticking out is going to get in the way when I try to install this in between the walls of the camper. So having a straight edge of some sort is a really good idea to just have this entire side pushed up against. I was using my fence of my table saw. I was also checking with my level to be used as a straight edge, and then also just double checking to make sure everything is staying square, because if it isn't quite square, it's not going to fit. I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to do this part, but just using straps actually worked pretty good. I tightened the straps down until all the gaps were gone in between each of these planks. And then I measured corner to corner, and I measured the diagonals, made sure everything was nice and square. And then I actually used 5-minute epoxy, which probably I didn't need to do. I actually kind of bailed on that idea and just moved straight to fiberglassing over the edges. And what I would say here is just use a lot of resin. Start in the middle and kind of work your way out. Otherwise, you're more likely to get air bubbles, or that's what I was finding anyways. And all I was doing was getting just enough fiberglass down that this part wasn't going to be moving too much, and it would be strong enough that I could get it in place before doing more reinforcements. Honestly, I was kind of nervous for checking the fit here because this was a lot of work, and this took up just over one entire panel, one panel plus a couple scrap pieces. And so that's a lot of material, and if I messed this up, it was going to be very frustrating. But the fit actually turned out to be pretty good. It actually flexed down a little bit more than I was anticipating, so you can see I didn't actually follow my radius line that I made there. But that's okay, it still worked out pretty good. I was anticipating this being slightly taller, but no problems there. And then I just propped it up with some sawhorses and some blocks, put some shims in to get it situated exactly where I wanted it. And then I was able to tack everything down, remove blocks, and continue on with all the busy work. Okay, I've removed the peel ply from the inside corners, and I kind of got lazy with moving the camera back and forth, but the outside is tacked together with CA glue, which is super glue, and then now I'm going to do the 5-minute epoxy on the inside corners now that I've removed the peel ply and tacked it all together. I really shouldn't have tacked it together on the outside with that CA glue. It was peel ply on peel ply and a really tight crack, so I wasn't getting a lot of super glue into that crack at all. But the issue with getting any amount of super glue into the crack, or accelerator spray for that matter, is both those things will melt the XPS foam. So if you are going to use super glue around this foam, just make sure you don't really get any of it on the foam itself. 5-minute epoxy though is perfectly fine. You're not going to be melting the foam unless you get like a really high buildup of the epoxy, in which case it'll generate a lot of heat, and then that could melt the foam. But as long as you keep the 5-minute epoxy really small, you shouldn't have any problems with melting foam. Here I'm using 2 scrap pieces that are nice and straight as straight edges to draw the profile of my roof panels. This is where my roof panels will sit, and they slope down from the front of the camper to the back. It's only about a 2-inch drop, as I said earlier in the video. And then once I get these roof panels in place to follow this profile, I just take my trim router and just trace that roof profile and I'll have a nicely cut roofline. In addition to removing all this extra peel ply that I'm removing, I wanted a perimeter line that would help guide where every single panel needs to sit. That way I know if it's sitting too deep or not enough. And then in addition to that, I took a whole bunch of scrap pieces, applied double-sided sticky tape to these pieces, and then stuck them right up against these guidelines so that all I have to do is push my panel down to these stop blocks, and then I can use 5-minute epoxy to tack all of these panels into place. I contemplated quite a few different design ideas for how I should assemble this camper. This is more or less how I knew I wanted the camper to look, but as far as assembling it, I wanted it to be as easy as possible. So I argued with myself, going back and forth, whether or not I should have the side pieces sandwich around the middle pieces, or I should do the reverse of that, or if I should even do a combination of that. And I figured a combination would definitely not be easy. So instead, I kept all the inside pieces at 78 inches, or just a hair under 78 inches, and then the side panels just sandwich around those inside panels. It keeps it simple. It's really easy to set that roof angle to whatever I want, and then take my trim router and just trace the roof. So that's pretty much why I did it. The roof was the main consideration, but all in all, I'm really just trying to keep everything simple and easy to assemble for myself. At this point, I'm pretty dialed in with how I do my fillets. I use that nice thickened epoxy, and then at this point I've been using my popsicle sticks to great success, so I just kept using popsicle sticks. And then I tried something new. I actually taped up all my fiberglass cloth, and then it's just ready to go to accept epoxy painted over the top. And this fiberglass cloth is permeable enough that the epoxy soaks through it really well. So even though I'm not priming before I'm sticking the fiberglass cloth up, it actually soaks through just fine. I really thought about using a thickened filler to fill in this space, but I figured it would be just as easy to figure out this wedge shape, and here I'm just cutting into a piece of cardboard until it fits just right, and then now I can transfer these angles to my table saw blade, cut out a piece of foam that's 78 inches wide, and then transfer the next angle to the other side, cut that out with my table saw, and then it should fit like a glove. I decided to use my foam board adhesive to glue this piece into place, and then I just used a little bit of tape to act as clamps. The fit isn't quite as perfect as I wish it was. It's just a tiny bit proud, kind of sticking out, but that's not a problem. I'm able to sand that off later so that it's perfectly smooth, and there's no problems when I go to fiberglass over the top of that entire front. Here I'm using my jigsaw to cut off a couple of the bigger pieces, but I found that really wasn't necessary, and I could actually just go straight to my trim router and just trace the entire outside and get it nice and flush. And then after that, I can go through with my 1.5 inch roundover bit, very carefully, mind you, because it is kind of a scary tool. And then also I kept a permanent marker nearby so that I could mark any spot that needed to be repaired, and anywhere that needed to be repaired, I would just take a little bit of 5-minute epoxy, squeeze it in or inject it into the little parts that might have pulled up when I was using the router, and then just tape over it and let it dry. This is the metal bracket that I'm going to install on all 4 corners of the camper. This bracket connects to the 4 camper jacks that lift the whole camper into the air so that I can back my truck underneath the camper and drop it into the bed of the truck. There's 2 main ways I used bolts to go through the camper wall and connect things. And the first way is to just use a metal sleeve that can go through the wall of the camper, and then the through bolt goes through that sleeve and compresses around the metal sleeve rather than compressing around the foam. And so that's a really nice, strong way to anchor anything or attach anything to the camper. It probably would have been plenty strong for these camper jacks, but to just add a little bit extra strength, I decided to remove this foam and add Kusa to the corners instead of just a sleeve. Both methods are strong. I've used both methods in the camper, but anywhere I wanted extra strength, I embedded Kusa. So in addition to these corners, I also embed Kusa into the anchor points for the ratchet straps. This plywood that I'm using with double-sided sticky tape to adhere it to the camper is working really well as a nice straight edge guide, but as you can see, I do actually need to do a second pass with this router bit because it's not quite long enough to do the whole thing in one swoop. This method worked out pretty good. However, like doing anything with a router, it leaves the inside corners kind of rounded. And so you can see here I'm using my saw and a razor blade to just get a nice crisp 90 degrees in those corners. And then the Kusa board that I'm going to be embedding in there will fit that much better. This is the 3/4 inch Kusa board that I'm going to be using for these anchor points. Basically what I'm doing is just cutting it up just like I would with any regular old 3/4 inch plywood. Definitely want to wear a mask because just like with all this fiberglass stuff that I'm doing, you don't want to be breathing in any fiberglass particles. And so I've got these all cut out. Basically all I'm doing is painting on a layer of epoxy. You could thicken the epoxy if you really wanted to go the extra step, but I think this is going to be a very good bond just by priming both sides and then sticking them together. I don't think there's going to be any air voids in there if you do it this way. And then you're left with a 1.5 inch thick piece of Kusa, which is perfect for embedding in my camper wall. I thought about connecting these pieces just by using a butt joint. I don't think there would have been any problems with that, but I decided to go ahead and just miter them to 45 degrees and then connect them by epoxying both sides just like I did before and then stick them together. I thought I was going to need some clamps or some way to hold these pieces tight this way, but I actually just stuck them together like this, and the tension from the liquid of the epoxy seemed to be good enough that they weren't moving. And so I just let them cure this way, and they were plenty strong afterwards. Throughout this build, I ended up using a couple different thickened epoxy type products. The stuff you've seen me do is where I mix my own epoxy and then I add my own thickening agent to make it thick. This stuff is already thickened, and all I have to do is mix the two putty-like substances together. And then this is actually advertised as a fairing compound, which is what I use for all the fairing that I do before the paint job. But it also works pretty well as just a light filler. And so this is what I decided to use with all my Kusa board plugs. And all it's doing is filling in gaps in there, and then I can remove the excess or squeegee it smooth, and it worked really well for this. This specific product is by System 3. They call it their Quick Fair compound, and it worked fine, but it was a little bit bigger of a pain to mix than the other fairing compound that I ended up using, which is by Total Boat, which is called Total Fair. And the Total Fair compound I actually preferred because it was a 1:2 ratio of mixing. So it's just a little bit easier compared to this System 3 stuff, which I can't remember off the top of my head what the ratio is, but they were both about the same price. They both worked really well as a smoothing fairing compound or light filler like I'm using in this situation, but I did prefer the Total Boat product a little bit more. On all of these foam corners where I'm using my roundover bit and going around the foam, every single time I touch foam against the ball bearing part of the router, you have to be really, really light up against the foam. Otherwise, that bearing will just go right into the foam, and so you're going to scoop out a whole bunch of foam that you don't actually want to scoop out. So I go really slowly over those. Another trick I came up with was just painting on just a tiny little bit of epoxy to get a buildup over that foam, and then the bearing has something solid to push against so that you don't have to worry about removing foam that you don't want to remove. Here I decided to fair over the top of the inside of my Cusa board plugs that I inserted in these corners, and that's because the thickness of the Cusa board was just slightly less than the thickness of the wall of the camper. The Cusa board was 1.5 inches thick, and the wall of the camper is about 1 5/8 of an inch thick, so it's a little bit thicker. So I had to add about 1/8 of an inch of material on the inside of those joints. The outside of the joints I made flush, so I didn't have to do any fairing before I was going to do my fiberglassing over the top. But on the inside, I wanted to bring that out before I fiberglassed the inside of those joints. Also, before I add fiberglass to these joints, it's really important that I sand both the outside and inside, because I can't rely on a chemical bond. That fairing compound is not chemically going to connect to this other epoxy that I'm using, and so it has to be a mechanical bond, so it's left up to sanding in this situation. Earlier in the video, I was talking about wishing I would have gone with a smaller roundover than the 1.5 inch that I used on all the outside corners, or most of the outside corners, I should say. But the 1.5 inch is really easy to fiberglass over. It's nice and wide, really round, and the glass just likes to lay over it nice and easily. One problem I ran into with this Cusa board piece is on that section I actually only used a 3/8 inch roundover, so it was a very minimal amount of roundover, and because of that it was simply more difficult to lay the glass over that rounded edge. So I wish I would have gone with a 1/2 inch or maybe 3/4 inch roundover on that Cusa instead of the 3/8. And the reason that I did a different roundover on the Cusa compared to the foam is I just wanted a very obvious separation for when it's all covered in fiberglass and paint. I wanted an obvious separation between where was it Cusa and where was it foam. On the inside and outside of these corner jack points, I just went with 1 layer of fiberglass cloth. And I did overlap them a little bit on the inside, but I just wasn't worried about strength past just the 1 layer of 6-ounce fiberglass cloth. I thought that would be plenty strong. And so far I've been right. I haven't had any issues with delamination or anything like that. So I think I was good on that point. When I get to the other Cusa anchors, I do reinforce them multiple times, because that's where I'm going to be getting a lot more potential force on the camper. So those plugs that I put in for the ratchet straps that connect to the frame of the truck, I actually add multiple layers. I think I ended up doing 3 layers of 6-ounce cloth, and then I got paranoid and I actually ended up adding a bunch of woven roven, which is a really thick, I can't remember how many ounces it is, but it's a really thick cloth. And then over the top of that, I actually added a 1/16 inch steel plate to act as basically a giant washer. And the reason for that is my biggest nightmare is that for some reason my camper gets ripped off my truck and falls onto the freeway. And so I really reinforced those anchor points because I don't want that to happen. This fiberglass cloth that I'm adding right here is a different cloth than I've been using this entire time. This is something I bought off of Amazon, and it is awful. I really wish I would not have purchased this stuff. I wish I would have stayed away from it completely, because the weave is so tight that the epoxy doesn't want to soak through it very well. So the other fiberglass cloth that I was using, I could paint from the outside of it, I could prime on the inside. Either way, the epoxy was going to flow nice and evenly through the fibers of the glass. This stuff, though, it just did not want to flow through it. So at first, I taped it in place, like I'd been doing a bunch of this stuff, and I was trying to let it soak through, but it wasn't soaking through. So I had to lift it up, prime underneath it, and then finally it would start to soak through enough to where I wasn't worried about getting a delamination in the future. But I did still have some dry spots, and I had to cut those out and fix them later on. So it is what it is. Well, I've come to a crossroads, and unfortunately, this fiberglass tape is just not gonna work. This cloth is a really tight weave, and this is the first time I've used it. I bought it a while back and decided not to use it because I just ended up getting this stuff, which is softer, it's a little bigger weave, and I figured it would fill in with epoxy easier, and I was right. It's actually a huge pain in the ass using this stuff, and so it's kind of a bummer. I prepped a whole bunch of the camper with this material, taped it up, ready to epoxy it, and it's such a pain, and I really hope this isn't gonna be a problem. There's a couple dry looking spots, and I mean, I primed the area under it first, laid it down because it just wasn't soaking through the cloth. So I'm just gonna go to the fiberglass store and buy some of this stuff that I was originally using and just carry on from there. Kind of a bummer, a couple hours setback, but this stuff just is not cutting it. I bought this off of Amazon. I'll put a link in the description so you know what not to buy. Yeah, but this stuff's great. I'll put a link in the description for this too, for what to buy. Yeah, Fiberglass Supply. Anyways, 4-inch tape. They didn't have any 6-inch, but I'm planning on overlapping all the outside corners with 2 layers, and so I can just stagger that and overlap the 4-inch cloth. Some fiberglass materials are easier to work with than others. I knew that would be the case. That's what I was reading online before I got into fiberglassing, but now that I've really truly experienced it, I can definitely suggest to stay away from cheaper, stiffer, tighter weave type fiberglass cloths and just stick with reputable sources like from Fiberglass Supply. They're going to be selling you good products that are going to be more money, but they're going to be so much easier to work with. So that definitely should be a consideration for any of you who are looking to get into fiberglass projects. A quick note on fiberglassing the front of this camper. The main thing is to just make sure the prep is there, which was me sanding down every single one of those 16 pieces where all the joints meet. Just sand them down a little bit so that they're rounded, and then when you fiberglass over it, the glass is going to lay so much easier over the front of the camper. And now finally, I get to build my door frame and then the door that's going to go with the camper. So here I'm wanting to embed some Kusa into the threshold of the camper. That way, anytime I step or anybody steps on the threshold, it has not just foam underneath it, but it's just a solid piece of Kusa that's not going to compress under the weight of somebody stepping on it. Just like removing the foam material from the 4 corners for my jacks, I use the exact same router bit. I had to do 2 passes since it couldn't go deep enough with just 1 pass. And then I'm finishing up with my Japanese pole saw because unfortunately I couldn't get my router in close enough to the wall. It kept wanting to hit the sliding plate of the router, so that's why I had to cut out just a little bit more with my handsaw. And the handsaw really works great actually for cutting into my foam. Pretty much all of my woodworking tools have been applicable for this entire build. Cuts into the Kusa nice and easily, cuts into the foam nice and easily, and really my only issue, and it's really not even been that big of an issue, is just that my saw blades dull really quickly when I'm cutting into fiberglass material, which just makes sense. Here I'm spreading Tyvek tape to the plywood underneath my camper shell, and this is going to keep anything from sticking to that piece of plywood, and it's also going to act as a form to make sure that my thickened epoxy isn't lumpy bumpy underneath the camper. This way it'll be nice and smooth, and it'll pop up nice and easily as well when I go to finish underneath the camper with fiberglass tape. I apply the thickened epoxy to the Tyvek directly, so that way I get a whole bunch of squeeze out and I get no voids underneath the camper, and I don't have to do any finish work after I pull this up from the Tyvek. And then that way the top part of it is nice and perfectly flat against the foam, and then this next part of Kusa can go over the top of it. As I'm building my door jamb, I need to make sure I'm routing all the rounded edges that are going to be very difficult to round once they're stuck in place. So here I almost forgot, and then I quickly just zipped that part of the threshold because I won't have access to that edge very easily once this epoxy is dried. And now that my threshold is finished, I can continue building out the rest of my door jamb. On the left side, I use 3/4 inch Kusa. On the right side, I combine two pieces to make it 1.5 inches thick, and that way the screws for my hinges just have a little bit more to bite into. Here I'm using my 5-minute epoxy to combine the Kusa to the foam. Really good way to do that. Unfortunately, you can see I'm missing a little tip piece right there, and that's because way earlier in this build I ended up cutting the length of my big Kusa panel that I had bought, and I just wanted to buy the one Kusa panel because they're kind of expensive, and so that was actually a mistake, and I knew as soon as I made that cut that when I was going to be assembling this door frame that I was going to be slightly short on all my cuts. I really don't think it's the end of the world though, since I'm epoxying all this together, and then I'm going to fiberglass as the final step over all of this Kusa, and that fiberglassing is really what's going to strengthen up this Kusa. So not the end of the world, but it was kind of annoying that I had to cut little tiny pieces out and splice them into my door frame, when if I hadn't made that mess up cut near the beginning of this project, that I wouldn't have needed to do that at all. Here I'm applying just a little bit of paste wax to some painter's tape that's on my level, and I'm just using my level as a straight edge to clamp my Kusa board to, so that as the epoxy is drying, it doesn't stick to the tape at all or my level at all, and I can just remove it nice and easily. I did, however, forget to apply that paste wax to the painter's tape that is stuck down to the top of my table saw, so that did actually peel off a little bit of the tape. You can see there. Kind of annoying, but not the end of the world. I can just sand that off or cut that off with my table saw, and not a big deal. I do use my roundover bit for all these pieces that are getting installed in the frame, but also I'm actually just barely making this frame thicker than the thickness of the foam, and that way after I glue all of these in place with my 5-minute epoxy, I can actually go back and use my flush trim router bit to flush up that door. And so the back side of the door, that's already flush, that's where I set the door frame, and then it's just slightly proud on the front. That's where I use my flush trim router bit. And then I actually go back through and use my roundover bit one more time on the front side of this frame, and then I'm pretty much ready for fiberglass at that point. Oh, also in the corners, because I couldn't get my flush trim router bit all the way into the corners, I just took my palm sander and just sanded down the corners until they were flush with the foam. I went back and forth on whether or not I wanted my door frame and door to have rounded corners or to have them just be square, but in the end I decided to have everything be rounded. So here I took a hole saw, cut out a hole out of a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, traced that hole onto my Kusa board that is at a stack of 1.5 inches thick, cut just inside that line in the Kusa board, and then now I'm going to tape down my hole, which is slightly bigger than the Kusa hole, and then use my flush trim router bit to make a nice accurate hole that prioritizes being perfectly up and down. Because I could have just used my hole saw to cut out the hole in the Kusa board, but then you risk being slightly at an angle, and then the hole itself won't be perfectly up and down, or at least the cut won't be 90 degrees to the surface of the Kusa board, which is what I'm after. When cutting out these little triangle pieces out of the circle, all I'm trying to do is get as close as I possibly can to the circle at that right angle, and then once I have 4 of them that are all the same, now I can glue them in place with 5-minute epoxy. And I found that tape worked perfectly fine as a clamp to hold these pieces in place until the 5-minute epoxy would dry. I haven't used my roundover bit yet on these pieces. I will on the outside once it's all set and I have a little bit of filler in there. I will be doing a roundover, but then on the inside I'm going to be lining it with more Kusa material, so I don't need a roundover on the inside at all. And this is that Kusa material. This is going to be going behind the frame, and it's going to overlap about 3/4 of an inch sticking out, so this will be the flange that will help be a door stopper and also help keep water from getting in the main cabin of the camper. But before I start cutting into my Kusa board, first I'm going to make a template using this 3/4 inch plywood and then transfer that to my Kusa board. This is kind of a tricky part to explain, but I'm going to do my best, and I think with seeing the video, hopefully this will make some kind of sense to you. So basically what I'm doing is I have that hole saw cutout with the same radius that's on the inside corners of my door frame, and I'm using that to draw this first initial line. And so that line that I'm drawing, that is the plug. That's the exact radius of the inside of my frame. And then because I want this to overlap, I want to have another line 3/4 of an inch away from that initial line, and that will be the overlap. That'll be the flange that you'll see, and then 3/4 of an inch on the other side of it. And basically the most important part to figure out, the most important part that's easy to get wrong, is that every single time you draw a new line with the compass, you always want to have the pivot point be the same. So when I'm using my compass, I'm always coming back to the same spot. When I'm using my router and I have a screw, that screw is going into that exact same pivot spot that I'm using with my compass. And then I pre-drilled a hole so that my router bit has somewhere to sit before I start this cut. And then to get the outside part of this cut, I need to adjust where my router is sitting, which it's just going to sit just barely on the outside of the board, just barely touching the board. And then my pivot point is still going back in the same spot, but now it's adjusted out a couple inches, about 1.5 inches actually. There's a lot of different ways to make templates. This is just how I came up with this one. Honestly, if I had a CNC router, I definitely would have just cut this out with a CNC router, or even if I had a 3D printer, I could have just printed this part out. But since I don't have either of those, this is what I came up with, and it worked out just fine. I definitely recommend labeling keep on anything you don't want to accidentally throw away, because I've definitely done that before in the past. And then here I'm just tracing around my template. I'm trying to get as much use out of my Kusa board as I possibly can, because like I've said earlier, it is kind of expensive. And so I'm keeping everything nice and tight together and then I'm going to go ahead and just cut this out with my jigsaw just outside my marker lines. And then once they're all cut out, I can apply double-sided sticky tape, ideally a fresh layer every single time I do this, but connect it to my template and then just trace it with a flush trim router bit. The way that I did this, where I mounted my router into a vise clamp, is probably not the safest way to do this. Actually, no, I definitely know this is not the safest way to do this. Usually I'd use my router that's mounted in my table saw, which is a designated router spot, and that's definitely the safest, easiest way to go. But I was using that router for my 1.5-inch roundover, so it was not in the table during this time. In a pinch, this works, but still, I definitely would not recommend anybody do this. Your hands are just a little too close to the router bit, and if for some reason it kicks out, it could be dangerous. So I definitely just recommend sticking with a router table and then use some jigs to keep your hands away from the router bit so that you don't have an accident. Here's another example of a dangerous cut that I don't really recommend people do. With this cut, I have to hold the piece very firmly up against my fence and then slide, and I can't have any wiggle back and forth at all. Otherwise, this piece would have just been kicked back to me really fast, really hard, and potentially hurt me. And while we're on this theme of what not to do, I still wouldn't use that router mounted in my vise like that. Use a designated router table. It's definitely a safer way to go. Once I have all of these pieces rounded over, I can glue them into place with epoxy and then finish up the last few pieces I have to finish out my door frame. There's definitely some pluses and minuses to building your own door and door frame. I really considered buying a pre-made door, and it would have just been so much faster is the main advantage. I would have only really had to have a cutout for the perfect size to fit the door frame, and then I would have just installed the door frame with the door and be done with it. This way is definitely a lot more labor intensive, but I kind of wanted to figure out how to make my own door, and this was actually a really satisfying part of this project, was designing and then actually executing that design into the camper build, and it saved me quite a bit of money. Some of the cheaper doors I was looking at were anywhere from $300 to $600, but the door that I actually considered the most was from Arctic Turn. They also make really good windows, but their door is $2,000. And even though that $2,000 door I'm sure would be fantastic, I'm sure it's a great door and would last a really long time, I wanted to take on this project and I figured I could build something similar. Maybe not quite as good, it won't be quite as dialed in because I'm making one of one, and they've had, I don't know how many experiments before they came out with that $2,000 door, but they have a dialed in product that I'm sure to many people is worth that $2,000. The final steps of my door frame is to add filler in a few little cracks here and there, and then add my fillet to the inside of the frame. This fillet that I'm using is the thickened epoxy from Total Boat, and so after this is all dry, I will need to go back and scuff it up with sandpaper before I fiberglass over the top of it, because it's not going to be compatible for a chemical bond to the laminating epoxy that I'm using. So it will have to rely on a mechanical bond through sanding. It's a good idea to be careful when you're sanding the Cusa board because you can remove a lot of material really quickly compared to the thickened epoxy that's much harder to sand. Before I get to fiberglassing the frame of my door, I'm first going to install Cusa plugs as the anchors to hold my entire camper to my truck bed. This is a super critical part of this entire build because the camper has to stay on my truck. It can't fall off. So these anchor points really need to be overbuilt and as strong as I possibly can make them. I used thickened epoxy to glue in these anchor points, and then on the outside I ended up using 2 layers of 6-ounce glass with epoxy, and then on the inside I ended up using 3 layers of 6-ounce glass. And then, as I said earlier in the video, I got paranoid about it still not being strong enough, so then I actually added a pretty big piece of 24-ounce woven roving to add more strength. And then over the top of that, I ended up using about a 6 by 6 inch piece of 16th inch steel that I epoxied directly over all of that to act as a washer and to help spread a bunch of the force over that area. So I really don't think this is going to fall off of my camper, and I'm not really sure what more I could do than what I've already done. I think it should be very strong, and I've driven probably 500-600 miles now with this on my truck, and I haven't run into any problems yet. Fingers crossed I never will have problems, and this camper just always stays on my truck. The other half of this equation is making sure you have really good tie-down anchor points on the truck itself. On my Toyota Tacoma truck, the stock anchors are simply just not strong enough, and so I actually bought and installed torque lift apex anchors that connect directly to the frame of the truck. So the ratchet straps that I install to these Kusa anchors on my camper are going to connect directly to essentially the frame of the truck, and so it should be very strong for the life of my camper. These are the 1/16 inch steel plates that I installed over every anchor. Unfortunately, I forgot to record me installing the woven roving over the top of the 6-ounce glass, but this is over the top of the woven roving, and basically what I'm doing is scuffing it up. I use some acetone to clean up any oils that might be on this sheet metal, and then now it's pretty much ready to install. All I have to do is add a little bit of thickened epoxy as my glue, and then I've got them in place with tape, you can see there, and then I just put a bar between the two with a little bit of a shim, and then it's just friction fit in there, and this will take about 30 minutes to dry, and then I'll have some nice strong anchor points. At this point in the build, I really just have a few joints left that I need to be fiberglassing over. Most of them are all pretty straightforward, busy work that I've done continuously throughout this whole project, but now I need to fiberglass over the frame of my door. And this was a little bit trickier and definitely not as straightforward as all the other joints that I've been doing, as the roundovers were much smaller. Being 3/8 of an inch, it was much more difficult to get the fiberglass to lay smoothly over the top of those rounded corners. And the inside corners were also challenging as well. I took out most of that material, so the inside corner of my door jamb is a very, very small cove, which just makes it more difficult to fiberglass over. I did get a few dry spots when I was doing this lamination, and it's really not that big of a deal. All you do is take a razor blade, cut out those little bubbles, and when it's over the top of the Kusa, all you need to do is fill it with thickened epoxy and then sand it smooth. And finally, I get to do the peel ply peel. This is the big one, where I remove all of the peel ply from the outside of the camper in preparation for painting. After I get all the peel ply removed, this is kind of my last opportunity to fix anything that need fixing on the camper as far as fiberglass goes. So what I do is I actually take a marker, and as I'm going through this final sand before I get to the next step, I'm just taking my marker and circling spots that are kind of squishy, where either I didn't fiberglass over or I sanded too deep and I went through the fiberglass. or I just thought a certain corner was kind of squishy and I wanted to add a second layer. This was my time to do it, and there was quite a bit of little patches here and there that I wanted to add and strengthen up, and I'm glad I took the time to do this because I'm really trying to make this camper as solid as I can. So anywhere that needed a patch, I made sure to add it. And then once this was all done, then I was able to remove these last few pieces of peel ply and start the long process of fairing out all the joints of my camper. I ended up using that green thickened epoxy from Total Boat. It's their epoxy fairing compound. And I was really happy with how easy it was to work with this fairing compound. As you can see, I was targeting all of the joints of the camper, so anywhere that I had some kind of a fiberglass seam, there would be a tiny bit of a ridge there, and so I'm targeting those spots to make them really smooth so that when I do my final sand and then I do my primer and paint, it comes out nice and smooth. Unfortunately, I should have done the fairing compound over all of the side because those little ripples that you could see in the epoxy did show up, and I wasn't able to sand those out with my primer layer.
Whew. Well, if there was a good way to get those off, I didn't know how it was. Never ran into these before. But, kind of a cool way they sealed them, actually. It's kind of a pain in the ass to get them off. So I think my camper should take almost exactly 1 gallon of this. So instead of measuring out the 3-to-1 ratio and then mixing maybe half a gallon or so, I'm just going to mix the whole thing. And they said that they left room, which makes sense, that they were able to do that. They left room inside this 1 gallon can for the rest of this hardener part, or what do they call it? Curing agent.
This is the primer layer that I decided to use. It's from Total Boat, called Total Protect Marine Barrier Coat, and it's an epoxy primer.
Starting to stopwatch. It's 65 degrees outside. This should last for about 5 hours, 4 hours at that temperature.
Honestly, this product is overkill for my project. It's meant for the underside of a boat, not really needed for a camper, but still a good product, nice high build primer, and it worked well for me.
I also got some thinner. This stuff is incredibly thick, and as I was stirring it, I could tell that. But my plan right now is to leave it as thick as I can because I'm going to be painting on horizontal surfaces. And so as long as I get even a halfway decent coat, I'm planning on not using any of this. I'm allowed to use up to 10% thinner, and I'm hoping I'm not going to have to at all. But I will if it's too chunky, if it's not, you know, I'm okay with a little bit of orange peel, but if it's going to be too chunky, then I will thin it with a little bit of thinner.
I did not explain that very well. The reason that I want to leave this epoxy primer as thick as I possibly can is because I want to get as high a build as I possibly can on the side of my camper. All of those little ripples that showed up when I was manufacturing these panels, I'm trying to cover them and fill them in so that when I do my sand, I can hopefully remove some of those ripples. Unfortunately, this did not go as planned, and like I said earlier, I should have just done the fairing compound everywhere that was super visible, because that is the best way to smooth out the ripples, not this primer layer. The primer layer did help a little bit, but as you can see, all of those little lines, they just don't go away. And so I actually ended up doing one additional layer of primer, which I had planned on doing. Like I said, I was planning on trying to get a super high build of primer, but I was hoping after this first layer that most of those waves would be sanded smooth, and they just weren't. So after I added my second layer of primer, I still had those waves, and that's when I realized that I made a huge mistake and that I should have just done a fairing compound from the beginning. But hindsight is 2020, and this is all a learning experience. They say education is expensive, whether you go to college to get it or you do a project to get that experience. Everything's going to cost money. I'm better for it now, but I definitely wish I would have taken the time to use fairing compound over all of the side of my camper. I wanted to get that first layer of primer painted onto my camper before I installed my jack plates so that I could install my jacks. And the reason that now I'm installing my jacks is because I still haven't actually finished the underside of my camper. And so this is my opportunity to get my jacks on, lift the camper up, and then I'll be able to finish underneath the camper. These jack plates were pretty simple to install, pretty straightforward. All I did was hold them in the exact place that I wanted over the Coosa anchor that's in there, and then I pre-drilled the hole for the 3/8 inch bolts that I bought, and they're stainless steel. And then on the inside of the camper, I installed a washer, a lock washer, and then the nut over the top. And later on, I actually take these off and also add just a little bit of blue Loctite, which is probably unnecessary as the lock washer is going to be perfectly fine for keeping that from backing out. But it's not going to hurt anything, so why not? Now that I've got my jacks on, the camper can be raised up. I'll have access to underneath the camper, and then I can do my second layer of primer everywhere. But before I spread that layer of primer, first I'm going to show you how I built my door, and then I will be adding primer to that door at the same time that I add primer to the rest of the camper. The main concept behind this RV door that I'm building is that I have my composite foam as the main part of the door, and then anywhere that I need to have screws going into or something that really anchors into the door, I'm going to be using Coosa board. So right here, I'm starting off with carving out a piece of Coosa to fit my RV lock that I bought off of Amazon. And it's been fantastic. I can't recommend this lock enough. It uses a keypad, so you don't actually have to have a key to open it. You just punch in the numbers for the keypad, and you can get your door unlocked. So it's been great. Really have enjoyed using it. But whatever type of lock you end up with, you need to be able to fit it into the Coosa. So basically what I did was just take measurements, mark up my Coosa board anywhere that I was going to remove material, and then use my jigsaw to remove the rough cut of the material, and then go back through with a flush trim bit and my router and pieces of plywood with double-sided sticky tape to act as a guide to remove the rest of the material so that I had a nice perfect hole to fit my RV lock into. The second part that I needed to cut out was for the latch mechanism. Here I drew the dimensions onto a piece of plywood, and then I rough cut the opening to fit the latch. And then what I did is just take another piece of plywood with double-sided sticky tape and just put it on one side of this hole, and then use that as a guide for my flush trim router bit. And then once I was happy with that, I could remove it, flip it on to the other side, and do the exact same thing with the same router bit. Now I can check the fit with my lock, make sure that latch mechanism, the little rectangular part, is going to fit through there, and then I can tape down that template to the Coosa board and transfer that rectangle to where my latch is going to be installed to. It's always a good idea to pre-drill a hole for your jigsaw, and then to always use a jigsaw to remove as much material as you can before you use your router bit. The only problem with using a router bit in this situation is that you're left with kind of a rounded hole rather than a nice sharp 90-degree corner in this rectangle. A lot of times I'll end up using a chisel to cut out that sharp 90 degrees, but for this I just ended up using my jigsaw, and it worked perfectly fine to get a nice crisp 90 degrees in those corners. I was really happy with the fit of the latch into that rectangular hole. That was a good fit, but this bigger hole I actually needed to carve just a little bit more out because it wasn't fitting quite right. So this took a little bit of time to dial in until the whole lock would fit into place, but eventually it did. And because this took so much time and energy to try to figure out a really good fit, if I ever rebuild this door in the future, which there's a decent chance I'm going to rebuild this door in the future, I'm actually just going to cut this whole mechanism out, or this piece of Kusa out, so that I can reuse it in my next door. Now, the reason that I decided to build the housing for this latch first was that everything kind of depended on this thing to be right. So before I was going to install Kusa into the foam, I wanted to make sure this was set. I figured if I messed this up, I could just cut out another piece of Kusa and try again. Fortunately, I got this right the first try, so no big deal. And once I fully assembled this latch mechanism, I was able to try it, test it out, make sure it was going to all work, and then I could go ahead and install this Kusa into the fiberglass panel. Now, when I usually build a door for like a cabinet, I'm trying to make the gaps between the door and the frame a little bit under 1/8 of an inch. But for this RV door, I want to make sure that it fits, and because I'm fiberglassing over it, it's really difficult to trim one side of the door if it doesn't fit right. I mean, you can do it, but it's kind of a headache, and you'll have to put some time in to get it right. So I made it just a little bit smaller to make sure that this wouldn't happen. So my gap ended up being about 1/8 of an inch, just over 1/8 of an inch actually, on both sides of the door and the top and bottom. To get this 1/8 inch gap, I actually had to make the door even smaller than that because the last thing that I'm going to do to this door is fiberglass over all of the edges. So that fiberglass is going to probably add a 1/16 inch to both sides. So I actually needed to cut this an additional 1/8 inch shorter to accommodate for the thickness of the fiberglass so that I could still get that 1/8 inch gap.
I just realized I messed up pretty badly. Painful. I forgot I cut this whole thing 1 inch and 7/16 shorter so that I could put Kusa board on one of the edges. And unfortunately, that means I needed to do the radius after I bonded the Kusa board to it. So that kind of sucks. Not gonna lie, that kind of sucks.
This really was a pretty big mistake, but it actually wasn't the mistake that I thought it was. I thought it was just a mistake of not putting Kusa on one of the edges, which at the time was the only plan I had for this door. But the bigger mistake is that I didn't line the entire door in Kusa. I should have done the 2 layers on that edge, which is where my hinges were going to be going, but I also should have lined the other side of the door, and I should have lined the top and bottom. This would have strengthened the door quite a bit, and anytime I had hot and cold variations, hot on the inside, cold on the outside of the camper, I wouldn't have had warping problems. Or I think that would be the solution, because I had warping problems. I still have warping problems. Anytime it's cold on the outside and hot on the inside, the door wants to warp. It's not a huge warp, it's really just about 1/4 of an inch, but it's super annoying and is the main reason why I'm probably going to be rebuilding this door at some point in the future. And the only difference I plan on between this door and the door that I'm going to be building in the future is that I'm going to line the entire door in Kusa. When I realized that this was going to be a problem, I actually did add some threaded rods with little anchors that I could tighten and try to keep the door from warping out during temperature fluctuations. I thought my solution to this problem was pretty good. In theory, I thought it would work really well, and it kind of worked, but not quite as well as I had hoped, and so yet again, my mind keeps going back to, at some point in the future, I'm just going to rebuild this door how I should have built it from the start. Also, another option for rebuilding this door is to just build it out of plywood, which adds quite a bit of weight, but it'll be nice and strong and rigid, and once I fiberglass over the top of the plywood, it should be just about bulletproof and waterproof. I'm not really worried about water even if it does touch the door, for whatever reason it does, because I have my vestibule on the back of the camper, and that really should keep any water from dripping on this door at all. And the other nice thing about building this out of plywood is that it would look like actual wood and not this fiberglass or painted fiberglass door, which still looks great. I'm happy with how it turned out visually, but there's just something nice about a real wood aesthetic. Well, one of the things I gotta figure out, and I was just seeing on Google anyways, that there's not a standard height for the handle off the ground when it comes to an RV. So, I'm not really sure what I should go with. I was thinking about just copying like a door handle that's like on the front door of the house, but because this is going to be on the truck, if I want to open this door from the ground, the lower it is, the easier it's going to be, so I don't have to reach up quite as far. So 3 feet is a regular door handle height. That right there. That's pretty much in the middle. Yeah. So maybe I'll just go right in the middle. I think that's going to be my plan. Here I'm centering up the housing for my lock, and then basically just cutting out the slot for this housing to go, which I'm just going to epoxy in with the thickened epoxy from Total Boat. The easiest part to mess up here is just the orientation of the lock. So this housing just needs to be labeled, and you just need to be very certain about how you install this into the door. And if it did get messed up, I would just cut it out, reorient it, and glue it back in place. Simple as that. These cuts don't have to be that perfect because I'm going to be filling any little imperfections in the cut with the thickened epoxy. But I did use my table saw to make those initial cuts, and then you can see I just used my jigsaw to make that back cut. The jigsaw is not a perfect cut by any means, but like I said, it doesn't need to be. In addition to flipping the Kusa insert around and accidentally getting the top or bottom mixed up, it's also pretty easy to mess up the inside of the door versus the outside of the door. And because the Kusa insert is only 1.5 inches thick, that's a little bit thinner than the thickness of the foam door. So the best orientation is to have the Kusa be flat or flush up against the outside of the door, and then the inside of the door is where you want the Kusa to be slightly recessed. It's just going to work out better as far as the latch mechanism to do it this way, and then also visually it just looks better to have it done this way. Once the Kusa lock housing is in place, and I've got a nice rounded edge from that recessed Kusa to the rest of the door, the rest is just preparation for fiberglassing over the top of, which really comes down to removing peel ply around the edge of the door, and then using a roundover of some sort to just make a nice rounded edge over the whole thing so that it'll accept fiberglass well. Rounding over these edges was actually kind of tricky because you don't want the ball bearing of the roundover bit to go against the foam, so I had to make sure it was going up against the more solid part of the door, which is the fiberglass part. And so rolling over that rounded edge, it just kept wanting to sink in kind of weird. Anyways, I'm not explaining that very well, but it was kind of tricky. But it really didn't matter too much. Any imperfections from that roundover bit that I was using, I can always just use a little bit of sandpaper, round it out a little bit more even if it didn't end up being even, and then if I scooped out just a little bit too much foam, I can always add filler, or what I actually end up doing here is just really goop up the epoxy into those little pockets, and then that way when I put the fiberglass over the top, the fiberglass kind of holds in that epoxy. And it especially holds in that epoxy well after I go over the top with a layer of peel ply. The peel ply also allows a little bit of epoxy to go in and out through the membrane of the peel ply, but for the most part it actually holds the epoxy in pretty well. All of this that you're seeing is more or less the exact same thing I've been doing this entire time on this build. But there is one difference, and that is that the peel ply, or the way that I lay the peel ply down, I should say, is a little different. If you remember, at the very beginning of this build, I was using a bubble buster as a way of laying down all of the peel ply. And that kind of worked all right, but the bubble buster has better applications for other things in fiberglassing than what I was doing here with this 6-ounce cloth. And so eventually I started just using a chip brush, and the chip brush really works really nicely, a dry chip brush, to just lay down the peel ply. And then that evolved to where I'm at this point, where I'm actually using my wet roller and just painting more epoxy over the top of my peel ply. And what that does is it allows the peel ply to lay really nice and flush up against what I'm fiberglassing, and I'm less likely to get dry patches on the other side of my peel ply. I can really see every single little imperfection. If there's a bubble that shows up, I know it's there and I can work that out. And peel ply is permeable, so the epoxy actually flows in and out of the peel ply just a little bit. And so what I found is that by putting epoxy on the outside of the peel ply, it helps fill up the weave of the peel ply itself, and in turn you're less likely to draw the epoxy away from the fiberglass fibers, and so you get just a little bit higher build of epoxy on the fibers itself, and it still peels up no problem, nice and quick and easy. Really the only downside to painting over the top with epoxy is you end up using a little extra epoxy, and that epoxy just gets ripped up. So maybe it's a waste, but I think it's worth it. My math was a little weird here, and then I fixed it and I forgot to show it on the camera. So I'm just going to explain it really quickly. This middle line right here goes to this point, is the radius for which comes from this. So the middle right there, and then that's the line. So that's this radius, the radius on the door. So that center point, these other lines that I'm going to be doing, and this is going to be 5/8 of an inch, or actually not 5/8, 9/16 of an inch over the original radius. And then I want to make the inside radius 1 1/4 inches away from the outside line, which is what I've got right there. And so the way that we do this is that I just always come back to the same pivot point here. So I line up the middle, I have got that line, and then I just line up the outside edge here, which is 5/8 of an inch overhang, tighten that down, that's that line, and then 1 1/4 inches from here to there, mark that, and then line up my pencil with that spot 1¼ inches away, and then you draw that radius. That's how I got it. The explanation that I used here is pretty much the exact same, and the part is the exact same as for the inside of the door frame. It is slightly different though, the dimensions are a little different, and so that's why I remade this and I didn't just reuse the same template that I used on the inside of the door frame. The 9/16 of an inch hangover is really important with this part. And I needed this because that 9/16 of an inch hangover is where my gasket is going to sit. I have a 3M gasket with a sticky side that I'm going to pull off and stick inside this hangover going around the entire door. And then that will be my seal to seal the door from elements getting into the cabin of my camper. As I was just saying, this perimeter is very similar to the perimeter that I built on the inside of my door frame. Really, the main difference is that this is about half the thickness, or less than half the thickness of that door frame. The door frame perimeter I did 3/4 of an inch versus all of these pieces I'm ripping down to about 1/4 of an inch thick. So it's much thinner. And the reason for that is I just don't want this thing sticking really far out from the door. And the last thing I'm going to do is fiberglass over the top of this perimeter, and so that will really lock it in place and make it nice and strong. So it really doesn't matter too much that it's going to be thinner. I don't need it to be thick. I just need something there to basically stick on my gasket. The way that I'm tracing my template this time is obviously different than how I did it before. Before I had my router mounted in my vice grip and I was running my template into the bit, versus here I was using my router and tracing around my template, and that worked just fine too. Definitely a little safer than having my router mounted and getting my fingers close to the bit. But still, I would recommend just mounting your router in a designated router table. I still think that would be the best way to do it. Now, before I glue down my perimeter with epoxy, I first need to prep the surface, which is mostly just removing all this peel ply. So I'm scoring, removing the peel ply. I'm going to use a little bit of denatured alcohol to make sure I didn't leave any oil on any of those sections. And then now I'm actually going to make a template to make sure that I set the perimeter pieces, especially in the corners, exactly at 9/16 of an inch overlap. So this is just a simple little jig I'm just assembling with some super glue, and it's going to set these pieces to exactly where I need them to be. Now, once I have this jig made, I can mark exactly where each of these rounded corner pieces needs to sit, and then all I got to do is 5-minute epoxy them into place, double, triple check, make sure they're exactly where I want them to be, and then take a clamp and clamp them down. Now, on the sides where I don't have any Cusa board to clamp around, I have to be really light with the clamp, as I was saying earlier, because you don't want to compress the foam. So just a really nice light clamp, making sure that it's in the right place. And then once those things are dried and set, it's basically just filling in those gaps with more Cusa board. And it's the exact same protocol, 5-minute epoxy, and just make sure that it's 9/16 of an inch away from the edge. Or I should say the overlap is 9/16 of an inch. Since I already have the corners set to 9/16 of an inch, it's going to be pretty easy, but still, I definitely want to measure that 9/16 along the edges to make sure that it's right on. And just like with the corners, I'm going to be using clamps to hold down these pieces until the 5-minute epoxy can set. And so just like with the corners around the foam, you don't want to pinch very much, so a really light clamp is all you need to hold down these pieces. And now that this flange is all finished, I can remove my peel ply and prepare for fiberglassing. Here I'm adding a filler not really a fillet, but a filler to the inside of this flange. And I want this to be just about perfectly 90 degrees. I don't want much of a round over. I do have a tiny bit of a cove on the inside of that, but I need room for my gasket to sit there, so I can't have much of that fillet getting in the way. And so that's the other reason why I decided not to fiberglass the inside part of that and just stick with fiberglassing over the top of this flange. So here I'm doing another fillet on the inside of my perimeter piece, and that's going to be very important for when I fiberglass over the top, because I do need that to be rounded. And then everywhere else you see me apply this fairing compound is just for making a nice flat surface. I probably should have fiberglassed over the top of all of this and then done the fairing compound, but I really don't think it's going to matter that much. I think for maximum strength I should have done it the other way, but I think it's fine. And then last but not least, I'm going to be doing sanding and scuffing everything up before I fiberglass over the top, because I have to rely on a mechanical bond for this fiberglassing. Here I'm still scuffing up the part that I'm not going to be fiberglassing, and that's just because when I get to the primer layer and then the paint, I want it to stick well, so I figured why not just go ahead and scuff that up right now so I can still get a good bond with the primer and paint. On the top side here, now I'm starting my fiberglassing. I like to lay out my glass first. I still actually pull it up, prime underneath it, lay the glass back down. I'm overlapping all of my pieces of 6-ounce cloth. And then once my peel ply is down and it's dry, I can just immediately remove it and start prepping for primer. As you can see, the edge is looking a little jagged, and that's because the glass is going right to the edge of that Cusa perimeter. And so here now I'm just going to take my router and I'm just going to trim up that edge so that it's perfectly flush between the Cusa and the fiberglass. And then I go back over the top of that with a slight round over so that that edge is round. And then I actually even take my sander and just make sure that there's nothing sharp from that fiberglass edge. So now everything is rounded and ready for epoxy primer. I can mix it up. It's the exact same product that I used for my first coat, but instead of starting with the camper, I'm going to go ahead and paint my door. I put it on really thick. I have these little cones that raise the door up, so that's what this door is sitting on. Once I get done with one side, I can pick it up, put my cones down, drop the door on top of those cones, and then that's just a nice tiny little point, tiny little surface area that is holding up my door, so it's not going to really mess up the primer too much sitting on those cones. And then I can go ahead and do my full second coat of the entire outside of my camper. And now that I've got the jacks installed on my camper and the jacks have lifted up my camper, I have access to the underside of my camper, and I can get my first coat of epoxy primer underneath it. So because this is going to be my last layer of primer, now once it's dry, I have to decide where I'm going to paint and where I'm going to leave primer. And what I decided is that on the sides and the front and the back, I'm going to scuff up and do a full paint job, and then everywhere else is just going to be left this gray primer color. The very top is all primer. The entire under bathtub area of the camper is going to be primer. And you see here I'm drawing this line, which is going to be the separator between paint and primer. So basically, I just need to sand above the bottom line, and then the bottom will all be that primer layer. That's the plan. This is my final sand before the paint job. And as I've been saying this entire time, one of my biggest regrets of this entire build is that I did not take the time to use a fairing compound over every square inch of the sides, the front, and the back, where it's really quite visible. And if I would have done that, I would not have those squiggly little lines show up in my primer or my paint job, but it is what it is. In the future, when I do another paint job, or if I do another paint job, I will definitely be using a fairing compound to flatten out all those little squiggly lines so that it's nice and smooth for the paint. After I got done sanding, I did vacuum the entire camper, and I used denatured alcohol to remove all of the dust from the outside before I started painting. I decided to just practice on a piece of paper and do kind of a paint by numbers mountain range. So, anyways, I should not have experimented by drawing on the surface first. I should have done this first, but anyways, it's all gonna work out. And the main reason that I wish I would have experimented on paper first before I drew any lines on the camper is that at this point I'm a little worried that these black lines are going to show up through my first layer of paint. And I was right, actually. You could barely see these black lines coming through the paint. I really need to take a picture of this, but I guess you can probably see that. And I'll just take a snapshot of it and make that the picture. Done. I've only got 5 colors that I'm going to be doing with this, and the 5th color is actually the primer layer, which I sanded up to that edge going all around it. That way I don't have to paint under it or anywhere that I really don't care that much about. Or the top, not painting the top, just using the primer layer for the top. Once I sketch out all my mountains, which line up with my paint by numbers that I drew on my piece of paper, I can go ahead and put my first layer of paint. And so here I've got 2 different cans. I've got 32 ounces or a quart of their color called Flag Blue, which is in gloss. And then I have my gallon container of Kingston Gray is what they call that, and that's also in gloss. And I paint my entire camper with these 2 colors. So what I do on the top layer is I just have my Kingston Gray as kind of the sky color, I should call it. And then all of the mountains are a mixture of that Flag Blue color mixed with the Kingston Gray. And the way that I mixed these wasn't the most scientific way, wasn't the most accurate way, but I kept it really simple. I had 2 different ladles. I had that little homemade ladle you see there, which is just a small little measuring cup with a popsicle stick tied together. And then I've got a bigger ladle, which is probably about, I don't know, 4 or 5 ounces. I didn't actually measure it, but I'm guessing around there. So now that I've got my ladles figured out, I'm using the big ladle with the Kingston Gray, and I've got 3 separate containers. Every container gets 5 scoops of the bigger ladle of the Kingston Gray, and that's kind of my base color. And then I take my small ladle, and I just start adding 1 scoop at a time into 1 bucket, mixing it, seeing kind of how dark it is. What I do is I just wipe it a little bit onto my camper, onto a section of the Kingston Gray, so that I can see the contrast between those 2 colors. And then I just keep doing that until my color is dark enough that I'm happy with it, so that these different mountain color schemes will actually show up. And this did take a little bit of time to really figure out, and I kept track of every single scoop that I would put into these containers. So on that one, you could see I had 2 scoops of the blue. So it's really not that much, but it changed the color enough that I was happy with it. And then on this one, I added, looks like 3 scoops, but I'm pretty sure I start adding more because it's just too light. And so I'm keeping track of all these scoops and then labeling them on each container. And because this is kind of a paint by numbers thing, I'm also keeping track of which number this is going to with which mountain. So the sky was number 1, the next mountain under that is number 2, the next mountain under that is 3, 4, and then 5 is the primer layer. This is my 3rd darkest color. I ended up with a total of 9 scoops with the small ladle of the flag blue color, and then I thoroughly mixed it, and then I'm going to set that aside for when I get to that part. And then this next mixture, I end up with, I think it's a total of 17 scoops, which finishes out that color, and I actually don't have any left after this final mixture. And then again, I mix it really thoroughly, and then I can put that aside. I'm going to mix it again still before I end up using it, but it's still a good idea to mix it as much as you can for as long as you can so that you don't have any streaks of that darker blue color in there. And so the whole inspiration of painting my camper this way is something called the Blue Ridge effect. And we have mountains where I live. We have the Cascade Mountains, which are close by, and then we have the far-off, distant Olympic Mountains. And the Olympic Mountains have this effect. A lot of times when I'm driving out towards them, I get this multi-tiered blue mountain effect that is very present, very obvious, and some days it's more than others, but I figured this is something I could do on my camper. It's nice and simple. All I'd probably need to do is have 1 or 2 color mixes. In this case, I just have 2 colors, and mix them together, and you can get this effect. The reason that this happens in real life is that air molecules and tiny bits of water or dust bounce blue light away from your eyes more than any other color. And then the further away the mountain is, the more air that the light has to pass through, which makes the effect even stronger. So this Blue Ridge effect is going to be happening with, I think, pretty much any mountain range, but depending on humidity level, dust level, all those different things, and how far away you are from the mountains, it's going to be more present on some than others. Like I said, I haven't really experienced this too much with the Cascades, but it's probably just because I'm always seeing the Cascades at a very close-up view compared to the Olympics, which are always very far off. But anyways, this is one of my very favorite effects to see on a mountain range. It's always such a joy to see that blue and just the staggered mountains that go to the gray background in the sky. And so I was really happy when I was able to come up with a game plan to put this on my camper. And since I'm really not a professional painter by any means when it comes to artistically painting something, this just seemed accessible, and it's one of my favorite phenomenon to see, so this was really just a joy to put this on my camper. This is a tiny mock-up of the hinge attaching to the door frame, which attaches to the door, and I've got that gasket in there. This is something I built before I actually built this door, so that way I had a really good game plan of how everything was going to line up. Okay, so this is the bottom end, this is the top, and so I want to wrap this gasket around it so that the seam happens at the bottom of it. So if there's any drips that happen, it all gets funneled to this spot and then can drip out. Figuring out the gasket was a pretty crucial part of this build. I wanted to make sure that I was going to keep any rain out of the cabin, and this door was the way that this was going to happen. But I needed to also figure out a hinge that was going to work well with the gasket. And so when I was trying to figure out how I was going to design this door, I basically just went to Google, typed in RV doors, and started looking at pictures of how manufactured RV doors were solving these problems. And they pretty much all used this hinge, this type of hinge called a friction hinge. And so I bought a couple off of Amazon. I'll put a link in the description, but I really don't think you're going to be able to go wrong with whatever you find. They all pretty much do the same thing. What they do is they pinch around the gasket, which helps seal out water, and then they have a friction element where when the door is open, wind that smacks up against the door isn't going to just slam the door shut because it has some resistance. And so that's what this hinge does. That's what other companies were using for their doors, so I figured why not do the exact same thing. And so far, I'm really happy with these hinges. I would just highly recommend that if you end up building your own RV door, to just build a little mock-up like I did. Take some scrap pieces of plywood and figure out the frame, figure out the door, figure out the little flange that the gasket is going to be sitting on, and put it together, make sure it's going to work for you. I can't imagine doing this without first having made that little mock-up. It would have been very confusing and difficult to wrap my brain around if I hadn't first made a little tiny mock-up. After I installed the hinges to the door, I did test the fit, and unfortunately it was just a little bit too tight. So I decided to carve out just a little bit where the hinges touch the door frame, which allows the hinge to sit flush up against the door frame, which I actually prefer. I think it looks a little bit better. But the main thing was just that I needed the whole door to move over about 1/8 of an inch, and this allowed that to happen, and then the door fit after I got done with this. Something I wish I had footage of, but I forgot to click record, was I actually reinforced these holes for the screws. So instead of it just going straight into Cusa, I actually take these holes and I drill out about a 3/8 inch hole, and I actually inject thickened epoxy into these holes. So I just take a regular old syringe, a pretty wide syringe, and I suck up some epoxy that's been thickened, and then I just inject it into those holes, tape over it, and then let that dry, and then I pre-drill into that epoxy, and then that's actually what the screw is going into. The Cusa itself will take a screw, but you really can't tighten it down too much. If you over-tighten the screw, you'll immediately strip it. And I suspect that the denser Cusa materials out there will probably take a screw better than this Cusa. This is the lightest weight Cusa that they had at the Fiberglass store. And like I said, I found it will take a screw, but you just can't over-tighten it. And so that's why I reinforced these screw spots with actual thickened epoxy, and it takes a screw much better, and I could really tighten down those screws without it stripping out the Cusa at all.
Welcome to RV Lock.
Okay, wasn't expecting that. This is the first time I've connected the power to my RV lock, and I have to say, overall, I'm very impressed with this lock. It has a key fob. It has the keypad on the back, so you can just punch in a code. It's very easy to program. It, of course, has little keys as well, but because it has that keypad on the back, I really don't use the key fob or the keys very often because it's just so convenient to punch in numbers. However, I do have one pretty big complaint about this product, and that's that the batteries just do not last in this thing. It takes 4 AA batteries, and I have to replace them every month, which is pretty annoying. I'm not sure if it's just my unit or if all of them end up doing this, but I do have to replace the batteries pretty frequently. I should also note that there is a little toggle switch on the inside of the lock that you can toggle on or off for having that electronic keypad component be activated or not. So as soon as you get done camping, you can just turn it off and not waste battery. But comparing this to my house lock, which is a very similar type product where you have a keypad and you punch in the numbers to get into the house, those batteries last for years. And it's also a AA type battery, but they're lithium AA batteries. So it makes sense that they're going to last a little longer, but still it seems a little ridiculous that the RV lock goes through batteries so quickly. Here I'm installing the strike plate for the RV lock. This is kind of the last step, and I just removed a little bit material at a time until the strike plate would sit flush in there and not get in the way of the edge of the door. You just remove a little material at a time until it fits just right. And then just like I did with the hinges, I actually did drill out those screw points and inject thickened epoxy in there to better anchor my screws.
Okay, I like how that is. And so now, adjust this.
This metal plate on the RV lock was just slightly proud of the door, and that's because I hadn't recessed it yet, but it is getting in the way. So I decided to trace it, remove it, and then that way I can just cut out a little bit of this material until that plate sits flush into the door, and then my door will actually close without touching that plate, and I'll be done with my door. I really should have just removed the lock to carve out this little piece, but I didn't. I just decided to cut it in place, and I had to be really careful of that gasket too. That's why I put a little bit of tape there, was to actually hold back the gasket while I carve into the Cusa. And so I definitely had to be careful to not nick the gasket, otherwise I would have had a little cut in the gasket. It would have been very annoying. I probably would have just ended up replacing the entire gasket, and I didn't want to do that, so I taped that back. And just like that, my door is complete. The latch fits nice. The gasket, at this point anyways, is nice and tight everywhere, and I'm ready to move on to building my vestibule. The vestibule, I went back and forth whether or not I was even going to build this. That's why I'm doing it so late in the build, is because for a while I was thinking I wasn't even going to do this, but I decided that just having a little eave on the back end of the camper was going to be really nice to help keep rain from going into the door. I can open up the door when I'm camping and just have a little bit of protection. And because it doesn't really get in the way or even go past the bumper of my truck, I figured this is a no-brainer. I just need to build this thing, install it, and then enjoy having just a little bit more protection from the elements. To build this vestibule, it's all kind of the same steps I've been doing throughout this entire camper build. I have a composite foam. I add a little bit of Cusa to the front edge of the vestibule, which this will add quite a bit of strength once I fiberglass over everything. And then also it allows me to anchor a screw into anywhere along that front edge. I probably won't be installing too many screws into this front edge. As of right now, my main thought was just that at some point I'm going to be installing clearance lights to this camper, and I thought this vestibule would probably be the best place to do it, right on the outer edges of it. And then the Cusa board just allows that to be nice and easy because that will take a screw. Here I'm using 5-minute epoxy to connect the triangle pieces to the main vestibule part. And then to make sure that they dry as square as I possibly can make them, I add double-sided sticky tape to the homemade squares that I used at the beginning of this build, and then stick them in place. Most of my edges are already nice and round from using my roundover bit, but anything left over at this point that's not perfectly round, I take my sanding block and just knock off all the edges and just make a nice rounded profile anywhere that I wasn't able to use my roundover bit. The rest of the preparation really comes down to just removing the small strips of peel ply here and there where I'm going to be applying my fiberglassing, and then I got to make sure I get a nice rounded profile on the inside of these two corners of the vestibule, which I'm just using my thickened epoxy. And then I can go through the full, kind of tedious process at this point, but full process of fiberglassing all of the edges, making sure everything is nice and strong, watertight, and then I can remove all the peel ply, or most of it, I should say. I do leave it on the back spine of the vestibule. And then I can use a fairing compound to smooth everything out, paint it, and install it. So, this is the visible side, because it's going to be going like this. And so the main part that we're going to see is underneath it, this side, but the top really won't be seen ever. So I'm not super worried about fairing compound on the top. I might do a little bit, It's also pretty smooth relatively. I don't see a lot of waves. There's one right there, but it actually looks pretty smooth. Versus this side, I don't know if that's going to show up, but it's very lumpy, bumpy. Just when I was building these panels, there was just a lot of little waves that showed up on that specific panel. So I've got a fairing compound that I'm going to try to smooth all of this out, as well as those sides. Like I said, not as worried about the top side, but I'm going to be fairing all that out. Here it is. Hopefully I bought enough. I think this should do it. So now I can remove all of my peel ply, but I'm actually going to keep the peel ply in place on this back strip here, because this is what's going to be glued to the camper. And so I'm just going to leave that intact until I'm ready for that gluing. And the reason that I want to leave the peel ply along that edge is that's what's getting glued to the camper. So I want to keep that edge as clean as I possibly can. I don't want any dust on it. I definitely don't want any oils on it. And also this helps prevent something called amine blush from potentially showing up when I don't want it. So I'm going to leave that peel ply on as long as I possibly can until right before I decide to glue the vestibule to the camper. I am by no means a professional when it comes to this fairing compound, but compared to earlier, I'm actually feeling pretty good about myself. Because this ends up being nice and flat, and it takes paint really nicely, and I don't see any of those ripples that showed up on the camper here. And that's simply because I put fairing compound over the whole surface, and so when I sand it down, it sands it nice and smooth, and when I paint it, it still looks nice and smooth, which is not the case with the side of the camper. So I decided not to use primer this time. On the main body of the camper, I used primer everywhere before I put the topside paint. It would be better to use primer, but I think it's going to be perfectly fine and durable, get really good adhesion to this textured surface that I have. And this is a very durable, thick paint, very high build. I'm going to try to not put it on too thick. There's a pretty good chance I'm going to be doing 2 layers. Finish isn't going to be perfect because I'm going to be rolling it, but it's going to be matching the rest of the camper, so it should be just fine. And as I said before, I left the peel ply on the back here, and after this is all dried, after I'm done painting, I'm going to peel off that peel ply and scuff up the, well, I'm going to trace this on the back of the camper and then scuff up everywhere that this will be sitting, and then I'm just going to glue it in place with epoxy, and then that should be a really nice strong bond, and I'll have this little vestibule to keep rain off of the immediate area when you open up the back of the door. That's the purpose of this. So, because I'm painting in the garage, I am expecting there to be some dust. Hopefully it's going to be minimal. We'll find out. This first layer, if a bunch of dust shows up in it, I'll scuff it up and then possibly just paint this. Tomorrow's a sunny day, so not as high a humidity, and I'll probably just paint it in the tent. I could also just paint it in the camper. I wish I had a whole shop just for painting and finishing. It'd make everything so much quicker. Because once I start doing this, I can't do the next thing in here because I'm going to make dust. And so I decided to just paint it inside the camper. I've got the space in the camper, and it's pretty much a dust-free zone. So perfect place to do any kind of finishing at this point. Just like I did on the outside of the camper, this vestibule is getting 2 layers of paint. Something I just realized I didn't talk about when I was showing the paint job of the camper is that this paint actually is really drippy. It goes on and it's fairly thick, but if you put it on too thick, it's going to drip. Most paints will do that, but I would say overall this this paint is maybe just a little bit drippier than most like household latex paints you might paint with. It's not a huge issue, but it's something to be aware of for sure. Here I have my temporary supports to position my vestibule where I want it and hold it up. And I'm just going to take a marker and trace around the entire piece. Then I'm going to remove everything and sand in between those lines that I just made. And I'm going to sand all the way to where it's white, which is where the fiberglass is. So I'm going to go through the paint, through the primer, through any bit of the... There's a little bit of green left over there. That's the green thickened epoxy. That's okay to leave a little bit there, but I really wanted to get all the way to the white. And then I'm going to vacuum it. I'm going to clean it with alcohol and then get my supports back in place. I'm going to remove that little bit of peel ply that's on the back end of the vestibule. Get some nice thick epoxy mixed up, and then I'm going to glue it in place. And then that'll be it. I did add tape around where the vestibule is going to go, and that's to make this just a little bit easier to clean up so I'm not making a huge mess with this thickened epoxy. And then at the end of it, I just pull up that tape and that removes all of that epoxy. And then one last thing I forgot to show on camera is that after I pull up all of this tape, I lightly sand that epoxy line and then I paint over it with touch-up paint so that you don't see any of that white line there. And that's it for my camper shell build. I hope you enjoyed this video enough to consider subscribing, and I'll catch you on the next video.